Okay, so let's take a look how collision handling works in Pymunk. So I'm going to API reference, and here is the pymunk.collision handler. So click on it, and as you see, a collision handler is a set of 4 function callbacks for the different collision events that Pymunk recognizes. Collision callbacks are closely associated with arbiter objects. You should familiarize yourself with those as well. And note 1, when shapes tagged as sensors, they will never generate collisions that get processed. So collisions between sensor shapes and other shapes will never called post-sol callback. They still generate begin and separate callbacks, and the pre-sol callback is also called every frame, even though there is no collision response. Okay, so as you see, first note, you should never need to create an instance of this class directly. So you don't need to instantiate directly a collision handler class. So this is the 4 callback function. The first is the begin, and it needs to return a boolean. So begin 2 shape just started touching for the first time this step. Return true from the callback to process the collision normally, or false to cause the Pymunk to ignore the collision entirely. Okay. And here is the post-solve callback, when 2 shapes are touching and their collision response has been processed. It does not return a boolean. Here is the pre-solve. 2 shapes are touching during this step. It also needs to return a boolean. And the separate callback. 2 shapes have just stopped touching for the first time this step. Okay, so I'm going back to PyCharm. And I have this falling circle and these 2 line segments. So now let's create this collision callback functions. So first I'm going to create a collision, so call underscore begin. And this function needs 3 arguments. The first is the arbiter object, then the space, and the data. And let's just print something to the console. So just begin, and this collision begin needs to return a boolean. So I'm going to here return true. Then create the collision, so call pre-solve. It also needs an arbiter, a space, and the data. And let's print to the console the pre-solve, and it also needs to return a boolean, so return true. And the last 2 callbacks will be the collision underscore post-solve with the same arguments. So I'm just going to copy and paste it and just print post solve. It does not need to return any Boolean value, and define collision separate. It also needs these three arguments: the arbiter, the space, and the data. And just print to the console separate. Okay, now we define the four callback functions. Now let's create the handler. So a handler equals space that add, here it is, add default collision handler. So space that add the default collision handler. And then I'm going to set the handlers.begin equal to this collision begin function. Collision begin without the parentheses. And then handler.presolve will be equal to this collision callback function. So collision pre and without the parentheses, and handler.postSolve equal to the collision post, and handler.separate equal to collision separate. Remember, you don't want to use here parentheses because you don't want to call this function, invoke this function. You just set to handler separate the collision separate callback function. So let's go back to here. As you see, as I said, the begin returns Boolean, and also the presolve returns Boolean. So here is the begin, it returns true, and the presolve also returns true. So now let's take a look. If I run the simulation, as you see, when the two objects, the line segment and circle, is touching, the pre and the post solve are called, and when they are separated, so they are no more touching, the separate callback is called. And let's go here, and when they first started to touch each other, the begin callback function was called. So once again, begin, separate, postsolve, presolve, presolve, postsolve, separate, begin. So these are the collision callbacks. They are very useful when, let's say, when two shapes are touching each other, let's say a bullet and an enemy in a game. Of course, you want to call a function, you want to do something, let's say subtract some value from the enemy's health. So you should then create a collision begin callback, and here in the body of this function, when the bullet is touching the enemy, you should subtract from the enemy's health.